Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. Picture this. It's 1937, deep in a remote Buddhist monastery in central Mongolia. The lamas who've been guarding something precious for centuries wake up one morning to find it's simply gone. We're talking about a sacred banner woven from the hair of Genghis Khan's war stallions, believed to contain the very soul of their nation's founder. Stalin's brutal purges were sweeping through Mongolia at the time, 30,000 people executed, an entire culture being systematically erased. And with that banner's disappearance, it was as if history itself was trying to wipe him from existence. For most of the 20th century, if you asked someone about Genghis Khan, you'd get the same answer: bloodthirsty barbarian, mindless destroyer, the boogeyman of history books. He was our go-to symbol for senseless violence and chaos. But here's the thing. What if everything we thought we knew was completely backwards? What if the real story was so much stranger, so much more fascinating, and frankly, so much more relevant to how we live today than anyone ever imagined? This question obsessed anthropologist Jack Weatherford enough that he devoted years of his life to finding answers. And we're not talking about dusty library research here. This man traveled the entire length of the Mongol Empire, Pacific Ocean, to the Mediterranean Sea. He traced ancient migration routes and followed Marco Polo's sea journeys. Then, when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1990, he became one of the first outsiders in nearly 800 years to enter the Ikkorig, the Great Taboo, the sacred, forbidden homeland where Genghis Khan was born and secretly buried. Working alongside Mongolian scholars who'd literally risked their lives to preserve their history, Weatherford pieced together a completely new portrait using a document the Soviets had feared above all others: The Secret History of the Mongols, a 13th-century epic written from the Mongol perspective by an anonymous author. What he discovered didn't just challenge the old story, it completely shattered it. His book, Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World, became a New York Times bestseller and fundamentally rewrote our understanding of history. Today, we're diving into that world together. We're going to discover how an outcast, illiterate boy, born into brutal violence and crushing poverty, became the greatest conqueror the world has ever known. But here's what I really want to show you. By the time we're done, you'll see how this one man, more than perhaps any other individual in history, laid the actual foundations for our modern world: global commerce, international law, religious freedom, diplomatic immunity. This isn't just ancient history. This is the story of how our world was made. To understand the man, you've got to understand the world that forged him. Close your eyes and imagine endless rolling grasslands under a vast, impossibly blue sky. That's the Mongolian steppe in the 12th century, breathtakingly beautiful and brutally unforgiving. Life here is a constant knife's edge between brutal winters, starvation, and other people who want what little you have. This isn't a world of nations. It's dozens of warring tribes caught in a relentless cycle of raiding, kidnapping, and revenge. The only law is the law of the strongest. Loyalty shifts like the wind, and betrayal lurks around every corner. Into this world, in the spring of 1162, a boy named Temujin is born. His very birth is marked by violence. His mother, Holun, had been kidnapped by his father, Yesuge, literally stolen away from her new husband, a member of the Merkid tribe. She gives birth to her first child far from home, a captive wife in a foreign land. And according to the story, when the baby arrives, his tiny fist is clenched tightly around a large, black blood clot the size of a knucklebone. Was it prophecy or curse? Sign of a great hunter or a great killer? No one could say. But that blood clot would come to symbolize the destiny he'd carved for himself. Temujin's childhood wasn't privileged. It was hungry, humiliating, and full of loss. When he was just 9 years old, his father was poisoned by their enemies, the Tatars. The clan took one look at his father's 2 widows and 7 young children and decided they weren't worth the trouble. They abandoned them on the steppe to die. But Hoelun, this kidnapped bride, turned outcast widow, refused to let her family perish. She taught her children to survive on the margins, hunting rats and marmots, digging for roots, fishing with hooks fashioned from sewing needles. They wore clothes made from dog and mouse skins. They were the absolute bottom of society. This brutal upbringing forged Temujin's iron will. He learned the full range of human nature in the most visceral way possible: cruelty and ambition, desire and loyalty. He learned that kinship, the supposed bedrock of steppe society, meant absolutely nothing without action. After all, his own relatives had left him to starve. Two events from this period shaped the man he would become. The first was murder. As the boys grew, rivalry festered between Temujin and his older half-brother Begder. In their fatherless family, Begder started asserting his authority as the eldest male, taking food from his younger siblings and claiming leadership rights. For Temujin, who was learning to see the world through strength and will rather than tradition, this was intolerable. One day after Begder snatched a fish Temujin had caught, Temujin and his full brother Kasar stalked him like prey. They crept up on him sitting on a small knoll and, with arrows drawn, killed him. When Hoyland saw what he'd done, she screamed at him, "Destroyer! Destroyer! You came from my hot womb, clutching a clot of blood in your hand." She was right. He'd destroyed the old order of his family. He'd chosen to lead rather than follow, and he was willing to kill anyone who stood in his path, even his own brother. The second event was an act of kindness. After the murder, the Taichid clan, the same relatives who'd abandoned them, captured teenage Temujin and enslaved him. They locked his head and hands in a heavy wooden collar called a kang, parading him from camp to camp. He was utterly helpless, dependent on his captors for every scrap of food and sip of water. But in this moment of total humiliation, he found unexpected compassion. Not from the aristocratic Taichid, but from the servant families ordered to guard him. An old woman secretly tended the raw wounds on his neck. A man and his children removed the kang at night to let him rest. When Temujin finally saw his chance to escape, he didn't just run. He hid in a river, and after dark made his way not away from the camp, but back to the tent of the family that had shown him kindness. Think about that risk. If they turned him in, he'd be killed, and they'd be rewarded. If they helped him, they risked death themselves. They helped him, they removed the kang and burned it. They hid him under a pile of wool, and, the next night, gave him a horse and food to escape. This was perhaps the most profound lesson of his young life. His own high-born relatives had betrayed him. Strangers of low birth, with no kinship ties whatsoever, had risked everything to save him. From that moment on, Temujin built his world on a revolutionary principle for the steppe. Loyalty mattered more than blood. He would judge people not by their clan or family, but by their actions and commitment to him. This idea, a meritocracy, would become the foundation of his empire. Freed from slavery, Temujin was now a renegade without a tribe. But he wasn't without ambition. He still had two things of value from his past: the girl he was betrothed to, Borte, and a friendship with a boy named Jamuka. These two relationships would define his next chapter. He set out to find Borte, whom he hadn't seen since his father's death 7 years earlier. Her family had waited and were still willing to honor the betrothal. Borte's dowry was a single, beautiful coat of black sable, the most prized fur on the steppe. For a poor young man, this was treasure. But Temujin saw it not as wealth to spend, but as an opportunity to invest. He remembered that his father had been an Anda, a sworn blood brother, to a powerful chieftain named Torgil, leader of the Karyid tribe, known as Ong Khan. The Karyid were a large Christian tribe, far more powerful than the scattered Mongol clans. Temujin took the sable coat, his only worldly treasure, and presented it to Ong Khan. He wasn't asking for a gift in return. He was making a strategic investment. He asked the old Khan to be his father and take him under his protection. Ong Khan, remembering his bond with Yasuge, accepted. With that single act, Temujin the outcast had secured the most powerful patron on the steppe. He and Portray were finally married. For a brief moment, it must have seemed like his struggles were over. But the cycle of steppe violence wasn't finished with him. 18 years after his father had kidnapped Hulan, the Merkid tribe came for revenge. One morning, a raiding party swooped down on Temujin's isolated camp. He and his family managed to escape on horseback, fleeing into the mountains. But they left Portray behind. She was captured, just as his mother had been a generation before. This was the pivotal moment of Temujin's life. He could have accepted his fate. He was a minor leader with a handful of followers. The Merkid were powerful. The expected course was to mourn his loss and find another wife. But Temujin was not an ordinary man. He refused to accept this. He hid for 3 days on the sacred mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, praying to the eternal blue sky. And he made a choice. He wouldn't live as a victim. He would fight. He'd get his wife back or die trying. He rode to Khan and reminded him of his promise of protection. The old Khan, seeing a pretext to raid the Merkid himself, agreed. He also sent Temujin to seek help from another rising young warrior, his childhood Anda, Jamuka. Jamuka, now a powerful chief in his own right, eagerly agreed to help his blood brother. Together, the 3 leaders assembled a massive army and fell upon the Merkid in a surprise attack. In the chaos of the raid, Temujin raced through the camps, screaming Portray's name. Hearing his voice, she jumped from a cart and ran toward him. They threw themselves into each other's arms in a tearful embrace. He'd won her back. But the reunion was complicated. Soon after, Portray gave birth to a son. The timing was ambiguous. Was the child Temujin's, or was he the son of her Merkid captor? The question of paternity would hang over their family for the rest of their lives. Temujin named the boy Jochi, which means guest, a name that only deepened the uncertainty, but he claimed the boy as his own and raised him as his firstborn son. After the victory, Temujin and his small band joined with Jamuka's much larger group. For the 3rd time, the 2 men swore the oath of brotherhood, this time as grown men and leaders of their people. They feasted and drank, and to publicly symbolize their bond, they slept together under a single blanket, as true brothers do. For 1.5 years, they ruled together. But a rift was growing between them, a deep ideological divide that would soon tear the Mongol world apart. Jamuka was a traditionalist. He believed in the old aristocratic order, the hierarchy of clans, what the Mongols called the difference between white bone and black bone lineages. His family was white bone, the noble elite. Temujin, a descendant of a captive woman, was black bone. Temujin, however, cared nothing for these old distinctions. He promoted his most loyal and skilled followers, Borchu and Jelme, to the highest positions, men who weren't his relatives but had proven their worth. He was building a new kind of society based on merit, not birth. This threatened Jamuka and the old guard. One day, Jamuka told Temujin that he, Jamuka, would take the horses and camp in the prestigious mountain pastures, while Temujin should take the less valued sheep and goats and camp down by the river. It was a clear message. Jamuka was the master, Temujin the subordinate. That night, on the fierce counsel of his wife Portray, Temujin did not go to the river. He and his followers broke camp in secret and rode away, not just from Jamuka, but from the old world he represented. And as they rode through the night, many of Jamuka's own followers, disillusioned with his aristocratic arrogance, left him and joined Temujin. The split between the 2 blood brothers was now a chasm. It ignited a civil war that would last for the next 2 decades. It was a war of ideas. Jamuka, champion of the old aristocratic order, against Temujin, leader of a new meritocracy. One by one, Temujin defeated the tribes that stood with Jamuka. The Tatars, who'd poisoned his father. The Taichid, who'd enslaved him. He even fought his own patron, Khan, after the old chief betrayed him and crushed the mighty Karaid. With each victory, he introduced radical new policies that shattered the old ways of the steppe. First, he completely changed the rules of warfare. Traditionally, the goal of a raid was loot. As soon as battle began, warriors would break ranks and rush to plunder the enemy's camp. This allowed many enemy soldiers to escape and regroup for counterattack. Temujin forbade it. He decreed that looting would wait until after complete and total victory was won. All goods were to be brought under central control and then redistributed systematically. Second, this redistribution was revolutionary. He ordered that a share of the loot be given not just to warriors, but also to the widows and orphans of every soldier killed in battle. He remembered his own mother's struggle and ensured that no family in his army would ever be abandoned as his had been. This policy inspired ferocious loyalty in his men. They knew that even if they died, their families would be cared for. Third, and most radically, he broke apart the old tribes and clans. After defeating a people, he'd execute their aristocratic leaders, but absorb the common people into his own, not as slaves, but as full members. He scattered them among new military units, organized in a decimal system, squads of 10, companies of 100, battalions of 1,000, armies of 10,000. Men from different tribes, old enemies, were now forced to live and fight together as brothers. Their loyalty was no longer to their old clan chief, but directly to their new commander and to Temujin himself. He wasn't just conquering tribes. He was building a nation. The final confrontation came with the Naiman, the last great tribe of western Mongolia. Jamuka had taken refuge with them. In 1204, through a series of brilliantly executed battles, Temujin's forces crushed the Naiman army. Jamuka escaped but was now a fugitive with only a handful of followers. A year later, his own men, hungry and defeated, betrayed him. They captured him and delivered him to Temujin. The final meeting between these two men who'd been blood brothers and bitter rivals is one of the most poignant moments in Mongol history. Temujin, seeing his old friend in chains, didn't celebrate. He ordered the men who'd betrayed Jamuka executed right in front of him. He valued loyalty above all else, even loyalty to an enemy. He then offered to reconcile with Jamuka. "Let us be companions again," he said. But Jamuka refused. He knew there couldn't be two suns in the sky. He acknowledged Temujin's victory and asked for an honorable, aristocratic death, one without the shedding of blood. Temujin granted his request. Jamuka was wrapped in a carpet and his back was broken. The man who'd been his first friend and greatest rival was gone. Now, no one stood in his way. In the spring of 1206, the year of the tiger, Temujin returned to the headwaters of the Onon River, near his sacred mountain. He summoned a great Kuriltai, a grand council of all the tribes of the steppe. Here he was proclaimed ruler of all the people of the Felt Walls. He named his new state the Yeke Mongol Ulus, the great Mongol nation. And he took a new title. He was no longer Temujin, the outcast boy. He was Genghis Khan, the oceanic ruler, Khan of all Khans. He was 44 years old. He'd united the most violent and fragmented society on earth. But his work, the world would soon learn, was only just beginning. Up until this point, the story of Genghis Khan is one of tribal unification. A remarkable feat, sure, but one that had been accomplished by other steppe leaders before him. What happened next is what sets him apart from everyone in history. In 1210, an envoy arrived from the Jurchen kingdom of northern China. The Jurchen, a powerful dynasty ruling over millions, considered the steppe nomads their vassals. The envoy came to announce the ascension of a new Golden Khan to their throne and demanded that Genghis Khan formally submit through a public ceremony of kowtowing, bowing so low your forehead touches the ground. Genghis Khan, now nearly 50, who'd bowed only to the eternal blue sky on his sacred mountain, was being asked to bow to another man. The story goes that he turned south toward the Jurchen capital and spat on the ground. Then he mounted his horse and rode north, leaving the stunned envoy in his dust. It was a declaration of war. In 1211, the Mongol army, a disciplined force of perhaps 100,000 cavalrymen, crossed the Gobi Desert and descended upon the great cities of the Jurchen. This was a new kind of war. The Mongols were masters of the open field, but had no experience with fortified cities. The Jurchid Empire had massive walls, moats, and an army that outnumbered the Mongols more than 2 to 1. But Genghis Khan was a relentless learner. He adapted. He turned the Jurchids' greatest asset, their large population, into their greatest liability. The Mongols would sweep through the countryside, setting villages ablaze and driving hundreds of thousands of terrified peasants as refugees toward the cities. These refugees clogged the roads, ate up food supplies, and spread panic. Then Genghis Khan did something no tribal leader had done before. He systematically collected engineers from among his captives, Chinese experts who knew how to build massive siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, and battering rams. The Mongols, who couldn't cast their own metal or even bake bread, now possessed the most advanced military technology in the world. They rolled these engines up to city walls and unleashed a terrifying new form of warfare. They hurled not just stones but pots of flaming naphtha and primitive bombs made with gunpowder. They used captured peasants as human shields, forcing them to fill moats and push siege engines forward. City after city fell. His war against the Jurchid was just the beginning. The world was about to be shaken to its core. In 1218, Genghis Khan sought to open peaceful trade with the great Muslim empire to the west, the Khwarezmian Sultanate, stretching across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, and Central Asia. He sent a caravan of 450 merchants with a message of friendship to Sultan Muhammad II. In the border city of Otrar, the governor, in an act of breathtaking arrogance and greed, seized the caravan and killed the merchants. To Genghis Khan, this was more than theft and murder. It was a violation of the most sacred principles of his new world order, the safety of merchants and the immunity of envoys. He sent ambassadors to the Sultan, demanding the governor be punished. The Sultan's response was to kill some of the envoys and shave the beards off the others, the ultimate insult, and send them back. When the mutilated envoys arrived at his court, Genghis Khan's anger was a force of nature. He withdrew again to his sacred mountain and prayed for 3 days and 3 nights. When he emerged, he had the verdict of the eternal sky: vengeance. What followed was one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. The Sultan expected an attack from the east, the most direct route. Genghis Khan sent a decoy army that way. But he took his main force on an impossible journey, a 2,000-mile trek across the waterless Khmer Desert, the Red Sands, a route even trade caravans avoided. He appeared as if from nowhere, deep inside the Sultan's territory at the gates of the noble city of Bukhara. Panic ripped through the empire. The Sultan's massive army, scattered across dozens of cities, was paralyzed. They'd prepared for a border war, not an enemy who could materialize out of thin air. In just 4 years, the Mongol army swept across Central Asia and the Middle East. They conquered legendary cities: Bukhara, Samarkand, Herat, Nishapur. They crushed every army from the Himalayas to the Caucasus. The Sultan fled, hunted by a relentless Mongol detachment, and died alone and abandoned on an island in the Caspian Sea. In 25 years, Genghis Khan's army conquered more land and more people than the Romans had in 400 years. At its peak, the Mongol Empire would stretch from the Pacific Ocean to the shores of the Mediterranean, from Siberia to India. It was the largest contiguous land empire in human history. But here's the most astonishing thing. It wasn't the conquest itself, it was what came after. Genghis Khan was a destroyer of walls, both literal and metaphorical. He smashed the old feudal system of aristocratic privilege and built a new one based on individual merit, loyalty, and achievement. He established universal religious freedom across his lands. He granted tax exemptions to priests, doctors, teachers, and undertakers. He created the first international postal system, the YAM, a network of relay stations that allowed messages and goods to travel with unprecedented speed. He created history's largest free trade zone. He established a universal law, the Yasa, that applied to everyone, including himself. He outlawed torture. He didn't hoard wealth. He redistributed it. He didn't build castles. He built bridges. The Mongols made no new technological breakthroughs themselves, but they were civilization's unrivaled cultural carriers. They brought German miners to China and Chinese doctors to Persia. They spread the use of carpets, lemons, and carrots from Persia to China. They took Chinese noodles, playing cards, and tea to the West. They combined Chinese gunpowder, Muslim flamethrowers, and European bell-casting to create the cannon, changing warfare forever. They were creating a new world order. As Genghis Khan entered his 60s, his thoughts turned to succession. This would prove to be a challenge he couldn't conquer. The old wound of Jochi's birth reopened in a furious family council. His second son, Chagatai, refused to accept his bastard older brother as the next great Khan. The two men physically fought in their father's tent. The dream of a unified empire was already cracking. A compromise was reached. Neither Jochi nor Chagatai would rule. The title would go to the third son, the good-natured and famously alcoholic Ogoday. In the summer of 1227, during a final campaign against the Tungut kingdom, Genghis Khan, now nearly 70 years old, died. Not in battle, but in his camp bed, surrounded by family and loyal soldiers. His body was returned to his homeland for secret burial. The soldiers in his funeral cortege supposedly killed every person and animal they met along the way to preserve the secrecy of the location. After he was buried, 800 horsemen trampled the ground to obscure the grave. The location of his tomb remains the greatest archaeological mystery in the world today. His body was gone, but his spirit lived on in his banner, and his empire lived on through his sons and grandsons. Under Ogoday, the Mongol World War continued. Ogoday's greatest general, the brilliant Subuday, led a campaign that would change the course of European history. In 1241, the Mongols unleashed a three-pronged invasion of Europe. They annihilated the armies of Poland, Germany, and Hungary in a series of lightning-fast battles. They destroyed the medieval ideal of the heavily armored knight, whose slow, massive warhorse was no match for nimble Mongol ponies and their riders. Devastating archery. The age of chivalry and castles was over. The Mongols stood at the gates of Vienna. Europe was theirs for the taking. And then they stopped. News arrived from 4,000 miles away. Ogoday Khan was dead. According to Mongol law, all descendants of Genghis Khan had to return to the homeland to elect a new great Khan. The Mongols turned their horses around and rode east, leaving a terrified and bewildered Europe behind. As one Russian chronicler wrote, "We know not whence they came, nor where they hid themselves again. God knows whence he fetched them against us for our sins." The death of Ogai set off a decade of internal struggle, an era known as the Warring Queens. The empire was ruled by powerful women, the widows of the Khans, primarily Ogoday's widow Toragin and Tului's widow Sorkoktani. Each maneuvered to place her own son on the throne. Sorkoktani, a shrewd and patient Christian woman, eventually won. Her son Mongke became the next great Khan in 1251. Sorkoktani had raised 4 extraordinary sons. While Mongke ruled as great Khan, he sent his brothers to complete the world conquest. Hulegu led the army west into the heart of the Muslim world. In 1258, he sacked Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, for 500 years, ending the golden age of Islam. At the same time, Kubilai, the most thoughtful and politically astute of the brothers, was tasked with the final conquest of the Song dynasty in southern China, the richest and most populous nation on earth. But in 1259, Mongke Khan died during that campaign. This time, the princes didn't return home. The empire fractured. Hulegu established his own dynasty in Persia, the Ilkhanate. The descendants of Jochi ruled Russia as the Golden Horde. And in the east, a civil war erupted between the last two brothers, Kubilai, and the youngest, Arik-Boke, the traditionalist guardian of the Mongol homeland. Kubilai won, not just with military might, but by controlling the food supply from China to the Mongol capital of Karakoram. But his victory came at a price. He was now the great Khan, but he ruled over a divided empire. Kubilai Khan was a different kind of ruler. He recognized that China couldn't be held by force alone. He moved his capital to what is now Beijing, founded a Chinese-style dynasty, the Yuan, and set about winning the hearts of the Chinese people. He adopted their customs, supported their arts, and built a vast, cosmopolitan administration that included Muslims, Christians, and Europeans like Marco Polo. This era, from roughly 1260 to 1360, became the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. For a century, a person could travel from Hungary to Korea with a single passport, the Mongol paisa. The Silk Road, once a dangerous trickle of trade, became a bustling superhighway of goods, ideas, and technologies. It was during this peace that the Great Exchange happened. Gunpowder, the compass, and printing, all Chinese inventions, made their way to Europe, where they would lay the foundation for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Age of Exploration. Europe, which had been a provincial backwater, was suddenly flooded with new knowledge, new technologies, and new possibilities. But the same system that created this global awakening also carried the seeds of its own destruction. In the 1330s, a terrible disease emerged from southern China, the bubonic plague. It traveled in the fleas on the rats that scurried along the Mongol trade routes. The Black Death. It was an epidemic of commerce. The plague ripped through China, killing as much as 2/3 of the population. It followed the caravans to the Middle East and, in 1347, arrived in Europe aboard Genoese trading ships fleeing a Mongol port in the Crimea. Over the next few years, it killed between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of Europe. The Mongol world system collapsed. Trade routes shut down. Foreigners were blamed. In Europe, Christian mobs, unable to attack the Mongols, turned on the Jews, burning them alive in public squares. Cut off from one another, deprived of the trade and tribute that was their lifeblood, the Mongol Khanates crumbled. In 1368, a Chinese peasant rebellion drove the last Mongol emperor from his capital. In Persia and Russia, Mongol rulers were overthrown or assimilated, becoming more like the people they ruled. The empire was gone, but the world it created was here to stay. When we look back at the story Jack Weatherford tells, it's easy to get lost in the sheer scale of it all, the epic battles, the vast distances, the rise and fall of an empire that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. But to me, the most profound lesson isn't about conquest, it's about creation. The traditional view of Genghis Khan paints him as pure destruction, a human earthquake leaving nothing but ruins, and there's no denying the brutality. The Mongols killed millions. They razed cities to the ground. But Weatherford forces us to ask a more difficult question. What did they build? And the answer is staggering. They built a connected world. Before Genghis Khan, civilizations were like isolated islands. Europe had little knowledge of China, and China had no knowledge of Europe. The Islamic world was a universe unto itself. The Mongols didn't just conquer these places. They smashed the walls between them. They created the first system of free trade on a continental scale, the first system of international law, the first international postal service, the first universal passport. They didn't just tolerate different religions. They made religious freedom the law of the land at a time when in Europe and the Middle East, you could be burned alive for believing in the wrong god. Genghis Khan's genius, and the genius of successors like Kubilai Khan, was their relentless pragmatism. They weren't ideologues. They had no culture of their own to impose. They were nomadic scavengers of a sort, not just of goods, but of ideas, technologies, and talented people. They took the best of every culture they encountered and spread it across their empire. They were the bridge that connected the world, and across that bridge flowed everything that would create our modern era. This book completely reframes our understanding of progress. We often think of history as a neat, linear story with the West as its central hero. The Mongols shatter that illusion. They show us that for a crucial century, the center of the world wasn't in Rome or Paris, but in the Mongol capital of Karakorum. They remind us that the Renaissance in Europe wasn't just a rebirth of Greek and Roman ideas. It was an awakening sparked by a massive infusion of knowledge and technology from the East, delivered by the Mongols. So what can we take away from this incredible story today? I think there are a few simple, powerful lessons. First is the principle of meritocracy. Genghis Khan built the most loyal and effective army in history by choosing leaders based on skill and achievement, not family or wealth. In our own lives, in our work, in our communities, are we looking for the white-bone aristocrats, or are we looking for the most loyal and talented people, regardless of their background? Second is the power of a unified vision. The Mongol tribes were mired in a pointless cycle of violence until Genghis Khan gave them a greater purpose: to unite the world under the eternal blue sky. He replaced petty feuds with a grand mission. It makes you ask, what's the mission that guides our own lives? What's the larger purpose that can unite us and lift us above our small squabbles? And finally, the most inspiring lesson of all, our origins don't have to be our destiny. Temujin was born into the worst circumstances imaginable. He was an outcast, a slave, an illiterate nomad from a despised and insignificant tribe. By all accounts, his life should have been short, brutal, and meaningless, but he refused to accept the fate handed to him. Through sheer force of will, an incredible capacity to learn and adapt, and an unwavering belief in himself and his mission, he remade the world. His story is the ultimate testament to the power of a single individual to change the course of history. That was a summary of Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World by Jack Weatherford. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, but I'll be honest with you. A summary can only ever be a map. The real treasure is in the journey itself. The real magic happens when you read the book yourself, in those quiet moments when a particular story or simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is designed to help you see if this book is a journey worth taking. If anything we've talked about today has sparked your curiosity or challenged what you thought you knew, I encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change the way you see the world and your own potential within it. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know that these journeys are meaningful to you, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the Billionaire's Bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.